I'm Stan Tarrant. For 65 years, this site served as the headquarters of Pacific American Fisheries Company. Now I'm going to tell you the story of PAF. Pacific American Fisheries was a Bellingham canning company. I like to think that as I'm sitting here right now, it would have been 100 years old. I joined PAF in 1930. In fact, I worked for PAF for 35 years, excluding 2.5 years of Army service, but I started as a bookkeeper at PAF and had various jobs after that. I was president for 10 years, and I really have fond memories of my relationship there, particularly with all the fine people I was permitted to work with, and we were just one big happy family. Galen Byrie was a part of that family.
No, it was a big outfit, and it's a good outfit. It was, when payday came, they had a slogan. PAF was pay after fishing, and that was a pretty good slogan too, because that's when payday was. It's said that one new family had just moved to the area, and when the little kids said their prayers at night, they always included, "And God bless the PAF."
Anyway, they had the biggest salmon cannery in the world there. They had a 19-line cannery right there in Bellingham near the office. They had salmon traps. They bought salmon traps. They inherited salmon traps with some plants they bought. And then they got interested in Alaska. They decided to buy canneries in various locations to spread the risk so that there would be no time that every place in Alaska would be poor fishing. And as a result, at the time I went there in 1930, I think we were operating 12 canneries, but we had about 30 locations. Of course, life at the canneries varied according to location, but most of the canneries were in isolated locations where they merely went in and right from the raw land started a little community. In order to house their people who they needed in the operation, of course, they had to have places for them to stay. So it wound up usually by forming a little village. And being far away, especially in the early days, from transportation and communication, the companies had to provide everything. They imported the labor. They provided the transportation from down Seattle or San Francisco because they couldn't find enough local people to do the jobs up there. In the early days, some of the old salmon companies had beautiful sailing ships. I used to see them in Bristol Bay in the 1920s, and some of them were the Star Fleet of San Francisco, the Star of Lapland, the Star of Russia, the Star of Falkland, and so forth. Those vessels made a beautiful picture, and they performed very well. They were an economical mode of transportation. And surprisingly, they made pretty good time going to Alaska. Once in a while, they'd get blown off course. In fact, I guess it happened more than once. They were almost blown clear over to the Hawaiian Islands on sometimes. And those ships were manned by the fishermen, as were the steamers, who were the sailors. The fishermen worked as sailors, but on the sailing ships, the fishermen really had a challenge. They had to furl and handle the sails and climb all over the ship. All in all, it was a way of life. It's gone now, but I'm sure a lot of people have fond memories of it. Fishermen were varied nationalities, but Predominantly, they were either Scandinavian or Italian, and back in the 20s and 30s, of course, early 30s, our cannery workers, who, that term designates those workers who actually clean the fish and fill the cans and do that sort of thing. They were hired under what we then called the China contract. It was a throwback from the old days when a China contractor provided all of the labor, that's the labor necessary to operate a cannery. And that was figured out by the company and the China contractor himself. And then, depending upon the number of men required and so forth, a rate of pay was agreed upon. And contrary to some of the rumors, in some cases they might have been true, but the workers, most of them received good treatment under this system. The pay, as it was everywhere in those days, was quite low, but the China contractor usually was quite conscientious about selecting good men and taking care of them because his pay depended upon the success of the canning at the cannery, and that's how he got paid. So he saw to it that the men were quite well taken care of. And in the wintertime, sometimes they were broke. Why, he would pay them a little money or advance the money, and it was a fairly good system. I was up there when we were using nothing but sail, of course, and we used sailboats, not through choice, but because we had to, up until 1951, 52. Pacific American Fisheries boats were white boats, and they were painted mast color or yellow, dark yellow inside. And they were choice boats. They were recognized all over as being some of the best. Our boats were about 31, 32 feet long. The wooden hull, it was a double-ender. It had a steamed oak ribs, and it had a keel made out of, well, tulip wood was one that we used, and then they had oak and various hardwoods. But these steamed oak ribs were the thing that held it together. And then we had, in the early days, Port Orford cedar planking, so the boats were very well made. And our boats in particular were made down in Oregon, and we'd ship them up to Alaska on our steamer on deck. When the fisherman showed up, he had his partner with him. The partner was called a boat puller, and the captain was a man to whom the boat had been issued, and it was up to him to get a good partner, or he probably wouldn't get a job the next year. He was given a mast and a boom for the sail and a sprit for the sail, which was a lighter stick or spar that was used to make the sail bigger by poking it up into the corner and then fastening the bottom of the sprit to the mast. We also issued the fishermen a tent. They slept in a little tent up in the forward or forecastle end of the boat. It wasn't certainly a real bedroom, but at least they could put their deerskin hide down there, which most of them use underneath some kind of a mattress, maybe an air mattress or none at all. And this tent enclosed them in that little space up in the front end of the boat. They also got what we called a Swede stove. It was a copper pressure kerosene-fired single-burner stove that they made their coffee on. And they had to cook in the boats, so they'd leave the cannery in those early days to be out on the grounds at 6 o'clock Monday morning, and they didn't come back until 6 o'clock Saturday night, and they had to cook and do everything out in that boat in that time without coming to the cannery. This Swede stove burned kerosene, so they each had to have something to get those stoves started. They didn't start very well out in the cold weather with kerosene, so each one of them got a pop bottle full of alcohol, wood alcohol. They'd use that to help start the stove. And then another thing we gave them, and the doctor used to put that up, were pop bottles full of hand wash, which was nothing more or less than carbolic acid and water. And that was to prevent their getting infected hands in the boat, which was quite common. And to prevent that, they used this carbolic wash on their hands. And also they used to bring ladies' hose with them, silk hose, and put around their wrists where the oilskins would chafe their wrist. They got a net. At that time we were fishing linen nets. They were issued 2 shackles of net. A shackle is 75 fathoms long and 28 meshes deep. They got 2 of those shackles of net made of linen. But one of the most necessary things, of course, was the food. And that itself it was quite an event. The issuance of food, the men lined up at the mess house or the warehouse where the mess supplies were stored, and the steward, generally the cannery steward, would come out and they would issue the supplies to the fishermen. And in most cases the supplies were put in a salmon box, and they were issued all kinds of things that could be kept in the boat without spoiling. And like, for instance, Scandinavians, they got some special stuff like that hardtack. We call them phonograph records, round hardtack. And also there was, of course, no fresh meat. They might get some, take it out for the first day or something, but they got canned meats of all kinds, everything under the sun. I didn't realize how much stuff could be canned. And the Italian boats, of course, they wanted lots of spaghetti and olive oil and that sort of thing, and they were issued Romanello cheese and Campbell's soup. Everybody got soup, and we got butter and eggs and that sort of thing. And also cooking gear. We gave them a Columbia River stew pot, they called it, named after the Columbia River boats. That's pretty much the story of how the fishermen lived out there. It was not comfortable. You can realize these are open boats with no facilities of any kind. They were always damp and wet because the boat was always wet, and their beds would get damp. But they went out with wool clothing and everything, but it was a tough life, particularly when they went out there from Monday morning till Saturday night without ever going ashore. They had to pull these nets in by hand and pick the fish out of them, and it was really tough work. And then if they had no wind, they had to use oars. They got 2 sets of 14-foot ash oars that weighed heavily, and they had to propel the boat by oars. Sometimes they'd have to row all day if they had no wind at all. Monkey boats were small gas or diesel-powered boats, usually around 35, 40 feet long, that would go out and perform 2 functions. One was to make sure they were around in case a bad storm or distress sailboat got in trouble. They would rescue them. A sailboat might go on the beach and have to be pulled off, and the monkey boats were alerted to the location of boats most of the time. They also were allowed to tow a loaded boat to the tally scow. They were not allowed to tow empty boats around the fishing grounds from one good fishing spot to another, or go prospecting, towing boats to places where there might be better fishing. They were not allowed to do that. Tally-scow was merely a place where the tallymen lived and where the fishermen could get hot soup and coffee and what have you at the time they were delivering their fish, and do anything else that might make them more comfortable. That it was largely, the tally-scow was largely to house the people who counted the fish out there and who saw to it that the fish were taken care of. On the Alaska Peninsula and elsewhere in Alaska, traps were probably the primary source of fish at one time. And traps were in most of the districts, Alaska Peninsula, Kodiak, Prince William Sound, and southeastern Alaska particularly. There were 2 kinds of traps. PAF had traps out on the Alaska Peninsula, for instance. They were all pile traps. The pile traps were generally located near some point where the fish traveled, and as far as the construction goes, they were formed by driving a long line of piling called the lead from the beach end out into the deeper water. And then there was a system of wire formations called the heart, and the pot and the spillers. Those are parts of a trap. The fish would hit this lead and follow it out toward the deeper water, trying to get away from the wire, chicken wire we would call it, but it was trap wire, like chicken wire. And that was hung from the piling on top above the surface of the water, down the water to the bottom. And it performed a wall of netting that the fish could not go through. And so they would follow that lead up to the hearts, which were V-shaped projections from the lead, which allowed the fish to go in, but they couldn't back out without confusing themselves with the hearts. Sometimes they had two sets of hearts. Well, then they'd keep going farther out, and they'd get into the pot, where it was enclosed wire again, and they had various means of getting the fish in and out of these pots into the spillers. And the fish were then brailed or fish dipped out of these spillers and taken to the cannery. Generally, we had one watchman who had a little house we sat on the trap called a trap shack. In southeastern Alaska particularly, another type of trap was used called a floating trap. In that case, the trap was constructed along the lines of a pile trap, but it did not have wire clear down to the bottom. It could be used in deep water. The wire was hung in such shape that it formed a sort of a box-like enclosure with a bottom in it. A floating trap, for instance, was assembled on the beach. They build the frame out of big spruce logs and get the frame all put together. Then they have to make the wire to fit the trap. They make that up in the warehouse ashore, out on the deck or dock. And that wire was brought out, and the hanging of the trap was done right out on the beach. So the trap frame would float, and they would work underneath and get this wire all assembled under the trap. And in the final analysis, after they got all the wire fastened and the lines and all the other attachments put on, well, they'd simply float the trap out of there and tow the intact trap, completely manufactured trap, to the location. It was anchored with very heavy anchors and cables, and serviced similar to a pile trap. The tenders would come alongside and brail the fish out of that floating trap in the same manner as a pile trap, except, of course, the pile trap was stuck up out of the water, and they'd have a little different type of gear and operate in a little different manner in getting the fish out. One thing about salmon traps, the age of the fish was known because they were alive in the trap until they took them out. And when you took them out, they all came out at the same time, so you had a complete fix on the age of the fish before they were processed. And the fish had to be processed within a time limit. I think it was 36 hours. They had to be preserved in some manner. So from that point of view, trap fish were considered very fine fish, if not the best from the standpoint of quality control. Set nets are merely a fixed form of gill net fishing. At one time, set nets were reserved primarily for widows and orphans and handicapped people who couldn't go out in a boat and catch fish. That was an accepted thing in Bristol Bay, for instance, that the issuance of set net sites or their use was confined to people who couldn't really handle a drift gill net boat. That changed, however, particularly with the advent of power. I don't know why, but when power came in, of course, they got a lot more different types of fishermen and naturally different types of gear. And set nets, the people began to occupy set net sites that were not handicapped persons and what have you. It was open to anybody who had a site. PAF, along with other companies, operated in a large number of purse seiners, various districts. Essentially, purse seining consists of a net or a bag that has lead line on the bottom and floats on the top. Used to be cork, or now they use plastic floats. And they have a skiff take hold of one end of the seine and tow it around in a circle, pull it around in a circle behind the boat, and then take the end back aboard the boat, so you have a big sack like a net strung out behind you, and the bottom has rings on it. The bottom is weighted down with lead like a gill net, and they have a line through these rings called a purse line, and when they surround what they think is a school of fish, they draw the purse line through these rings and form a purse. The bottom is pursed up, so you have a bag in effect, and you have the fish confined in that bag. Then they move the boat and the bag close together and dip the fish out of that bag, called brailing with a brailer, and load it aboard the ship. The iron chink was a name given to a machine that gutted and cleaned and cut the head and tail off the fish. We had a line of what we called slimers at a sliming table with lots of water and brushes, all gloves and perfectly sanitary operation. They would scrub the inside of the fish and examine each one by itself and make sure that it was properly cleaned and all blood and everything removed. And they went over into what we called a filler bin. And there the fish would fall onto the feed table, which was a row of fingers that ran through slots that picked up the fish, and they were horizontally fed into the filler machine. And the filler would allow one piece of fish the size of the can to slide into the can and compress it so that the can would leave the filler with 16 ounces or 15 and a half ounces, whatever the weight was. From there it would pass over an inspection table where they had generally 2, 4, or 6 people, depending, who would inspect all these cans as they passed by. And if there are any cans that were improperly filled, or if they had meat hanging over the top that might impair the seam that would be put on them, they were checked again. They went through a salter on the filling machine. They automatically salted. A 1-pound tall can got a 1/4 ounce of salt that fell into the can as the fish were put in. The next machine it went into would be the clincher. It went from the clincher into the vacuum machine. The can then would leave that vacuum machine and either roll or be pulled by a cable to the end of the line, we call it, where it was fed into coolers. These coolers were trays, slotted trays. In fact, they were made out of band iron with spaces between so the cans couldn't fall out. 168 tall cans would go in, as I remember. And when the tray was filled, another tray was put on top of it until they had the proper number of trays that would fit into the retort where they were cooked. And then when the retort was filled with these cold cans, the doors were closed and sealed, and then the cooking process started. They cooked for 90 minutes. A tall can would be cooked for 90 minutes. The temperature is ordinarily around 242 degrees. Then the steam would be blown off the retorts, and after all the steam was out and it was safe to open the doors, they were taken out, and the cans were cooled. Looking back, and particularly now, I often consider how important Pacific American Fisheries was to Bellingham, and the fact that losing the company meant a lot to all the people of Bellingham, and we had a fine organization there. We had good people who were experienced, and they loved the company, and they got along fine. In fact, hardly a day went by that someone wouldn't comment on the fact that PAF had been important to them personally. So many people from Bellingham went to Alaska. A lot of young people went up there, and they really financed their education by working in the canneries and so forth. And of course, we used a huge amount of material and labor. We did a lot of work there in the wintertime when they had the traps and what have you, and the Puget Sound operation going. It was a very, very important industry in Bellingham. The stockholders of PAF decided to liquidate the company in 1965 because of lack of confidence in the industry. It was a sad time for those of us who worked there, but the foresight of the company's founders is very evident today. For example, each one of the 3 major PAF plants at King Cove, Excursion Inlet, and Petersburg now produces as much salmon as the entire PAF did in 1964, and the Alaska salmon resource is as strong as it was 100 years ago. I like to think that the legacy of the PAF will last a long time, and that future generations will continue to benefit from this great resource.